So based on the phase 2 results from our recently completed cystic fibrosis trial, we will begin preparations for designing and executing our phase 3 program, and that's clearly our highest priority. And I got to tell you, it's a good priority, because if you think about cystic fibrosis, patients are still dying between their 35th and 40th birthday, and that's just not an acceptable standard of care. The standard of care has clearly risen over the last couple of years, but I don't think anybody would agree a life expectancy of between 35 and 40 years of age is really an acceptable standard, even with that progress. And the good news about the acebilustat program is we're actually addressing a component of treatment for cystic fibrosis, which is currently a huge unmet medical need. That's in tuning down an overheated immune response with administration of a drug like acebilustat. And while that standard of care has risen over the last couple of years, I certainly say it's a good thing to wake up in the morning and think we could do more for these patients. And that's what Celtaxsys is focused on, enhancing the standard of care for patients with CF, and we're delighted to be engaging with regulators to design that phase 3 program. Celtaxsys just completed the largest phase 2 research program ever completed in cystic fibrosis research history. And I'm very pleased to say we saw some very important outcomes and very consistent signals in acebilustat's ability to reduce pulmonary exacerbations for patients with cystic fibrosis. Unfortunately, even with the best standard of care today, patients are likely to continue to exhibit or have frequency of pulmonary exacerbations. And we added acebilustat on top of standard of care in a 52-week trial, and saw that acebilustat actually reduced the frequency of pulmonary exacerbations and prolonged time to the patient's next exacerbation. So as you can imagine, prolonging time to your next exacerbation is a really good outcome. In particular, what we observed was most beneficial effects in patients who are either on a CFTR modulator, which is a current new standard of care for a large majority of patients. Roughly half of the patients currently today have access to a CFTR modulator, which is a drug that improves ion channel flow and hydration of organ systems, which is really the hallmark of cystic fibrosis. It's estimated that in the next 6 to 12 months, an additional 40%, so roughly 9 out of 10 patients who have cystic fibrosis will have access to a CFTR modulator. We saw benefits of adding acebilustat on top of CFTR modulation therapy. So the most current standard of care is improved when you add acebilustat on top of that standard of care. The most beneficial effects we actually saw was in the mild population. And the mild population accounts for roughly 3 out of 4 patients today in the CF community with cystic fibrosis. Roughly 3 or 4 patients are designated as having mild lung disease. And the projection is that more and more patients will be in that mild category as that standard of care increases. What was really notable is that we saw a 34% reduction in the experience in the rate of pulmonary exacerbations on patients on acebilustat versus those patients on standard of care alone and placebo. That 34% reduction is quite clinically meaningful. The CF Foundation is very encouraged by that. They've pledged their continued support for Celtaxsys and the continued progression of acebilustat development, particularly in that mild population. And if you really step back, it makes a lot of sense. If you look at the history of research, the earlier you can interdict in a chronic disease, the more you can slow down the damage that's associated with that disease. And so the earlier we interdict care with acebilustat, the more we can reduce exacerbations and reduce the permanent lung damage that's associated with each and every one of those pulmonary exacerbations. And so we're very excited to move acebilustat into a phase 3 program. These are the registration quality programs that get a drug approved for commercial sale across the globe. And that phase 3 program will look at patients with cystic fibrosis who are mild, on a modulator or not, and we'll add acebilustat on top of their standard of care, and we'll study those patients for 52 weeks and ideally show that same robust effect in reducing pulmonary exacerbations for patients in the CF community.